Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first Water and Communications segment for the week, Communications in Transformation. 2023, as you both know, marks the halfway point for the implementation of the SDGs and the Water Action Decade. But to achieve this, we need to communicate the urgent need for change. To help me do that and discuss and unpack this question, I have with me today Daniela Boström-Kuf, Communications Manager, UN Water, Astrid Nergård-Friis, Group Vice President of Sustainability, External Relations and Communications at Grundfos, and online, I'll wait till she comes online, we have Stella Odhiambo, Communication Manager at Wasafari. Great, hi Stella. Can you see us? Perfect. So Daniela, I'm going to start with you. The UN has been in focus, as you know, the last 2 days. After the UN Water Conference of 2023, there was a lot of expectation. A lot of people came together to make the changes they wanted to see. And we had Federico yesterday talk about his review and analysis of what came out of that agenda. What I want to ask you is the communication that came out of that agenda. From that conference, do you feel that water received a better standing point? Has it been mainstreamed? Is it being understood differently?
Yeah, thanks, Rati. That's a great question. I mean, the conference was a momentous moment, I think, for so many of us. And it did go beyond the sector, I found. That's my personal opinion. I feel that there's this renewed energy. The Secretary General puts it really nicely, the UN Secretary General puts it really nicely in his foreword to the report that we wrote afterwards, and he called it this renewed hope and sort of renewed fresh vision of hope. And I think that of course is great. But what I would like to add to that is that I think that us in the water sector, we have that hope already, and we've had it for so many years, and that's why we do our jobs every day. So what I feel really came out of that was that renewed energy instead. And what I see how it's reflected is in the speed how we now produce things. So after the conference, we produced this report that's called the SDG 6 Synthesis Report, the Blueprint for Action, where you really see, following up on the conference recommendations, how can the UN system respond to it? And it was produced in record time. So I do feel that that's been some sort of a shift there. And I also felt from a comms perspective that in the preparatory process, when UN Water was assisting UN DESA and, of course, the co-host in organizing the conference, we were invited by the UN system, that also works a bit in silos, to brief about the conference. So, to task forces on food or on the SDGs and so on. And you can kind of see that aha moment. Karen was referring to it just in her closing remarks, that there is that aha moment, oh, this is broader. But then just to end, I mean, in terms of the mainstreaming, I do feel that, yes, the campaign we did went really well, best campaign ever. But the media is not picking it up still. And that's not because the media is doing a bad job or that we're doing a bad job. It's just that water is still seen as that scientific, sort of siloed subject. And we have a lot of work to do there.
And I think with that, I come to the industry perspective, because, of course, what you're saying is really interesting, that it's actually increased momentum for outputs and communication within a certain sphere. People are understanding more, people are actually seeing the connectivity. Again, what Karen said in terms of not focusing on one SDG, but the interactivity, the interplay of all of them. And then it comes to the stakeholders that engage in this conversation. So it's not just the UN family that is listening and hearing and acting, but it's actually the larger recipient family of the water story. And Astrid, I come to you then to ask you, you were at the Water Agenda, you were at New York, and the team saw what was happening and actually had suggestions and reviews and kind of opinions about, from an industry's perspective, what do you need to see to make this change happen?
Yeah, thank you for the good question. We were, of course, delighted to be there, to meet with a diverse group of people, to discuss and share information in various different spaces, in side events and speaking opportunities, etc. And of course, we want to be there and we should be there because we need to create awareness. We need to help shape a call for action to solve the water crisis. With that being said, we also found there to be some challenges seen from a private sector perspective. The private sector is expected to drive the change. And at the same time, we are met with increasing demands, expectations, requirements. So when you bundle this, you really have a very complex problem to solve, and it is extremely resourceful for the private sector to actually bring that change. So I think our reflection is, in order to find scalable but also financially viable solutions, we need to be involved earlier on when we actually develop commitments. So that would be my ask, that involve us early on when we start these discussions. And I listened in, I sat there listening to some of the earlier panels, and one of the words, or two words that was used, was actually stronger collaboration or stronger cooperation. So that is really my ask.
So if we take this and go back to you and Water with the ask that Astrid has, is that to bring you in the process a little bit before what has been done up to now.
Yes.
Because you want to be part of the change, and to do that, you have to be part of understanding the recipient obligations that you might face. So then I'm going to ask, we talk about stakeholder engagement a lot in the communication strategy of creating mainstreaming water. And Stella, where we're based today is also a lot of where we come from. We bring with us the baggage of our past. And we have to unlearn, we have to pivot, we have to look at life differently. We've heard that today and we've heard it yesterday. Could you share what you've heard from Astrid and Daniela just now in terms of stakeholder collaboration? What would you need to see to make these two asks come into fruition?
Thank you very much, Arati, for the question. And thank you, Astrid and Daniela, for your insights. So first of all, I heard some really interesting things from both ladies. We've spoken about renewed energy, connectivity, stronger collaboration, as Astrid has just talked about. And I feel like these are really great examples of opportunities for stakeholders to explore partnership that maybe they would not have naturally gravitated towards. And I really think as long as complex problems exist within water, you'll find that there will be opportunities to collaborate. There will always be opportunities to collaborate. So from the systemic work, for example, that Wasafi does, we have seen that these issues, like both ladies have said, are very intertwined, they're very interconnected. And so problems within water are often connected to problems within other sectors around it. This in itself provides a good opportunity, like I said, for stakeholders across all these different sectors to explore these unconventional partnerships, even sometimes when their motivations and their goals are a bit divergent. So even when we look at something like the food, water, energy nexus, which is something, as Wasafi we've dealt with, which is also a huge global conversation at the moment, we see that water and sanitation will always be part of the solution when it comes to thinking about providing sustainable energy sources. And it will always be part of the conversation as well when we're talking about safe food production. So yeah, you find that the three will go hand in hand. So there's lots of avenues there to explore for collaboration between the energy, agriculture, water. So yeah, for me, as long as complex issues or problems will exist, there will always be opportunities for stakeholders to come together and do something about it.
So, of course, that we've heard earlier today that water goes beyond water, to actually answer the question. I think it was Leon that spoke earlier saying you go into the communities and you start looking at water problems and you realize, oh no, this is not a water problem. This has actually got so much more in terms of how to engage with water being the outcome or the symptom of what we're trying to tackle and improve. But we now, I'm coming back to you, Daniela, have this epicenter of conversation around policy. We have this conversation around frameworks in the UN. And we have Astrid talking about wanting to be part of the change, come in earlier, stakeholders, finding out at the point when you come into the communication that water is not the problem. Is there information overload? And if we're trying to move out of New York and we're trying to reach other parts, who are not necessarily engaged in the information that's coming out and the how-tos, the wheres and the why-fors. How do all of us kind of break through the noise to get at what's really important?
Yeah, there's so much information overload. Just scrolling my Instagram feed and LinkedIn feed, and you just want to turn it off. Yeah, it's such a big question. I think that how we have chosen to work is that we use kind of a communications notion, ABC, action-based content, and we really try and focus on that in all the type of work we do, because we've seen that it has a better uptake than when we evaluate our campaigns or our communications work. And I would like to illustrate that with an example. So for the UN 2023 conference, of course, it took place on World Water Day, which is one of our biggest campaigns. So every time we do a new campaign and we want to engage the public, what should we do? How should we engage them on this topic, and so on? So we thought this is our moment to really try and go broad. And I like working with symbols a lot. So here we chose a Peruvian folktale, you might know it, some of you, with a hummingbird that's flying from into a pond. There's a big forest fire, and she's trying to put out the fires with her mouth, bringing one drop after another. And all the other animals are laughing at her, going, "Are you crazy? You will never be able to put out this fire." And she says, "I'm doing what I can." So we used that story and that bird to then illustrate how everyone in the water sector, how everyone in the world can do their part to help solve the water crisis. And then a bit further on in the kind of preparations for the campaign, we thought, well, how can we make it even more actionable? So we reached out to the schools that we have contact with, and we said, can the children in your school produce these little origami hummingbirds and send them to us so that we can take them to New York with us and give them to the leaders. I'll give these two to you afterwards. To the leaders of this world as a way to connect the leaders to the children whose future is at stake. And we developed an action list of 10 points that we wanted the children to write on them. So we thought that we would get like a couple of hundred of birds. It's expensive to send and so on. We got 8,000 from 21 countries. So that was a challenge, but we, showed them in New York. We distributed them. We hung them around sort of some trees and things, and it was so endearing to see these little messages coming, from Sweden, where one of the action points was to fix leaky pipes. So, you have a 9-year-old Swedish girl who's promising to fix leaky pipes, and I'm thinking to myself, you will probably never have that problem in Sweden. And then, we had other birds from Ghana, where we knew, because we interviewed them, that this little boy in question, he has to walk for water every day before school, and he misses out on school. And he can write on his bird, "I promise to save water as much as I can." I find that really powerful. And I think that these little birds, they are these reminders of, everyone else is doing something, so why not can we as leaders also do something? So I'll give these to you afterwards. So yeah, I find that that's a way to break out of this paralysis, to help people to do something about it very tangibly.
That actually gave me goosebumps, I have to say, because that's with people talking about what they can do, despite what they're facing every day. But then what you're saying is the action that you took and the results that you received. If you were to simplify that lesson, it's to break through the noise by saying, this affects you, this actually touches you, and that's how we can communicate for change, is not to necessarily step back and say, look around at the science of this, but actually look at what's happening in your life. Is that what you would say?
Correct. And also, I think that this idea of someone else is solving the problem for me, we can't do that anymore. We cannot just trust someone else to make this happen. We have to do something ourselves. And I think that showing world leaders that all these kids out there, all these youth, they are doing their part. So we also have to do something about it. So this idea of sort of the ability to respond to something, not just taking responsibility, but really the ability, what can I do? What can I do to solve this? Yeah, I think that works.
And it touches at the heart of the question. And then it comes to, of course, Astrid, when you talk about, Daniela mentioned paralysis and apathy with this overload of information. How do you cut through it? And I think the example is so touching in terms of how you can, if you want to work with nudging behavioural change, saying how can we actually make a difference? When it comes to industry, when it comes to what you've said, the technology and the recipient overload of the regulations that you have and what you're responding to, how do you want to work and how do you break through the apathy, and what do you want to see in the communities that you're engaging with?
Yeah, too much information. I think even going to this space, there's a lot of information. So I think also from a personal perspective, you also need to make choices. But too much information is almost like water. Too little information is not really good. Too much information, not good either. And if we talk about too much information, there are risks associated with this information overload. You get skewed perspectives. At least there is a risk because they're so you find it becomes difficult almost to distinguish between relevant or irrelevant information, and then you also risk that you lack engagement, simply because there's so much and people just skim through context instead of just really engaging into the different issues. And then there is, of course, also the inherent risk of not getting any decisions or inaccurate decisions as a consequence of people almost becoming paralyzed. And then you also mentioned, is there apathy for change? I think a lot of people, like myself, we still have difficulties actually comprehending what it is that we are actually facing. And combine that with the fact that it's also very difficult to find solutions in this space. We need to develop them, we need to innovate. But in this space, people become reluctant to change. So from a comms perspective, what do we need in this space? We need at least relevant, clear and concise communication to break down these barriers or cut through the white noise. And to cut through the white noise, we need a more strategic approach to communication. It needs to be clear, relevant and concise. We need to, as a private sector as well, we need to clearly communicate about what we do and what we do not do, and also why. And if we the private sector, in my line of business, we have to talk to customers about changing to energy efficient solutions. We also have to talk to our customers about what we can do to help them solve their challenges in respect both on water and climate. So cutting through this white noise really requires a strategic approach to communication.
And what you're both actually saying here is you have to find that touch point. You have to find that point that creates the reaction and that need for change instead of assuming it. And then I come to Stella now on this, because Stella, of course, you're working now between the Global North and the Global South. You're working with programs that are also looking to create change on the ground. And a lot of times you're translating, I would like to say, messages from framework outputs to action on the ground. What are you seeing as some of those touch points that actually create that change and move towards behavioural shifts?
Thank you again. So I think that careful shaping of this critical messaging from all these diverse stakeholders is vital to creating a shared understanding and a shared vision of the change that, or rather the vision of what we want, of the change that we want. So no doubt about that. As a systems change organization, we really try to focus a lot on making communication two-way. And so instead of us just delivering a message, which is usually coming from a higher up and cascading downwards, we try and create spaces for other voices to be heard and for communication to travel in both directions, yeah? So I feel it's very important for those of us in this, who hold this communication mandate, to ask ourselves, what space am I creating for other voices other than, you know, the source of where this transformative agenda is coming from, or this messaging is coming from? What messages are we crafting? What platforms are we creating to sustain to sustain this change that we want to realize. Yeah. And maybe if you can allow me to just give a quick example. This, from my perspective, yeah. So this is from the Good Food Hub. The Good Food Hub is an online community, online platform of food SMEs that Wasafiri started after we realized that SMEs contribute so much, especially into the food space, into the world of food. Making it healthier, making it more accessible, making it more affordable. But their voices are usually overlooked. Their contributions are often overlooked. And so in 2022, that's last year, we hosted a series of dialogues between food SMEs and a host of key stakeholders in the food system. Yeah, so from finance also to climate change, we're all involved in these conversations. And this was basically so that SME voices can be heard and factored into the conversations where these important agendas and policies are being birthed, such as the UN Water Conference, for instance. And then when the war in Ukraine caused this massive spike of food prices globally, because of these dialogues, we're actually able to ensure that the impact of what the SMEs were going through was felt and heard by those who are managing this global response. So yeah, I think other than the messaging, which is very important, and like Astrid said, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be clear, it needs to be very concise. So other than that, how we frame it as well is important, how we deliver it, the channels we're using are very important. But just ask yourself, what else are we doing to make sure that we see sustainable, transformative change? So yeah.
And Stella, what I'm hearing also is that what's a precursor to actually create these platforms is that you're looking at cross-sectoral engagements. So you don't have the luxury necessarily of having a meeting about water today, and a meeting about food tomorrow, and a meeting about climate the day after. You need to use time effectively. So this cross-sectoral alignment is critical in the work that you're doing. And that's something now that's, we could argue, is moving upwards. So it's understood, of course, in New York, in DC, in Stockholm, that this cross-alignment needs to happen bi-directionally, you could say. But then when we talk about the possibilities and the solutions and the how-tos to cut through the noise, you have, of course, the world of ChatGPT. You have generative AI. You have deep fakes. You have bad journalism. What do you do with the growth of misinformation that is coming as a counterforce to everything that you're doing and everything that we are working to move together faster, in a better way? Astrid, when we spoke earlier, you talked about the amount of information Grundfos has to deal with when it comes to working to counter misinformation and actually be the force of change, like you say what you do and also say what you don't do. How do you tackle this?
That's a good question, really. Misinformation, disinformation, fake news. For sure, there's no quick fix. But I think that it's... Sorry, I just lost it.
No, I'll come to Daniela, actually, because, of course, one of the things that's important is that when we talk about fake news, and that's...
Yeah, sorry, I lost my track here. No, but I think it's really everywhere. And I think most of us saw most recently the Pope wearing a puffer jacket. And this was, of course, in the more innocent part of the scale. But then you have, we can all imagine that it really could become much worse and much more damaging. So I think from a private sector perspective, it's really something that you cannot ignore. And I can give you a most recent example from our own turf. It's not, you could say, water related. I work in the ESG space, and I work in the DE&I space as well. And quite recently, we heard rumors from people outside Grundfos that our pride flag was not raised on one of our locations because allegedly the manager of that location, found it to be against his religious beliefs. It turned out not to be true. But I think that example illustrates something that has also been mentioned several times here, and that is that misinformation like this actually has the potential or risk of actually polarizing people, and in the same ballpark, eroding trust in a strategic direction or commitment. So I think getting back to comms, what we need to do here is when we communicate, we have to be very transparent and honest. We work in a global space, so we also have to be very respectful and tolerant because we are communicating with a diverse group of people. And that also means to cut through to the truth, we have to base our communication on facts, and we have to double-check facts. Otherwise, we risk the downsides of misinformation and disinformation.
I think the two words you used are so important: trust and fear, and to have like this communication that actually targets trust or actually breaks apart trust, and it's founded on fear. It assumes that you will react and polarize because it's a binary response. Either it's me or it's you. And Daniela, now where you sit and the work that you're doing on communications, you're also facing this. And of course, the message you're sending out is so important. How do you counter these claims that cause reactions of fear and lack of trust?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to comment very briefly on what you said because I thought it was so interesting. I think the media, I was complaining about the media, water not being in the media. But actually, after the conference, we were reached out to by USA Today. They wanted to check a claim that the UN 2023 conference had said that there will be water rations for everyone in the world. So this is part of the whole conspiracy theory. And I found it so interesting that we didn't know about this article. And USA Today was actually checking it with us to produce a counter article. So it's like the media is also helping now with this, and I just love that sort of direction that's taken. But yeah, to your question, I think that there's of course a very kind of broad theoretical side to how you counter misinformation, disinformation. But then there's also that very practical and personal level to it. And the UN is doing great work right now. They've just released a report from Global Communications about how to counter misinformation, disinformation through an integrity brief. It's going to lead to a code of conduct from member states in terms of how they manage information. So that's great. But then I think that we all also, again, back to this kind of what can I do, have some sort of work to do as well. So I'd like to illustrate that with an example because for me it's so important that when we who have the knowledge about how devastating and important these issues are, it's so easy for us to fall into judgment. So I met a neighbor the other day, and he was telling me that his well, he has a well, and he needs to now report it to the local authorities because it's part of the regulatory for the city and so on. It's a very small village, and immediately I found myself saying, why? And he was saying, yes, I'm going to pay more tax, so now I'm just going to use my drinking water to water my really big garden. So that breaks my heart, obviously, and it's very easy for me to fall into that judgmental space. But I think that for us, it's so important then to realize that there's a difference between what's right and wrong, which is linked to judgment, and then what's good and bad, which is linked to conversation and being open. So took it upon myself not to fall into that trap there and then, and try to ask him questions instead. For how long have you had this well, and are you giving this to your grandchildren afterwards, and do you know that actually your grandchildren might not have any water? But kind of having that conversation instead. And I don't know if he's going to report as well. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that if I had judged him in that way and gave him my spiel of I work for the water sector and it's really important that you do this and so on, he would not have done it. So I think that's sort of the more personal work that we really have the responsibility to do.
No judgment. That is really critical, and I think everyone at the conference the next 4 days really needs to keep that in mind because it's so easy to say, oh, but you don't know. and you're misinformed, but actually you close down communication in that instance. You don't allow for any behavioral change. You don't allow for a conversation to understand their why and to maybe understand how that can be shifted. And Stella, then I come to you on this because you're working with these change platforms on how to create the understanding of moving from no to maybe to yes. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, I'll talk a bit about a module of change that Wasafi use, and we call it system craft. So over the past decade or so, Wasafi, we've worked on so many different issues. Water, food, conflict, energy, health, just to name a few. And in all these areas, we use system craft, and it's been reverse engineered from all the experience that we've gathered over the years. And so basically, system craft works by applying these 5 dimensions of change, that's what we call it. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, I'll just talk about one in particular, which is called Make It Matter. So yeah, make it matter. It's all about making the transformative agenda matter to those who will affect this change that we see. So we make sure, basically, we make sure that these stories for change that we share are really, really connect emotionally, that we address practical concerns and values of those who will be affecting this change in a way that they can really resonate with. And we see that over time, this does tend to change perspectives, change behavior on both ends. So for instance, just a quick example, if we look at something like equitable access to water and sanitation, for example, what people really want to know is how will this affect me today? How will this affect me tomorrow? How will this affect my children? How will this affect my family and my society? And so, yeah, this is where we can really start connecting with people. Just like Daniela started explaining to Aniva, this is actually how it will affect you. That is when we really connect and see some of this change start to happen.
Make it matter. I think that's really important because my last question to all 3 of you, something that's come up again and again, of course, in the last 3 days, is the importance of listening. And of course, that comes into communication challenges that you've both spoken about, because to understand someone's perspective is to understand where they come from, but also to enlarge in the question. So there's inclusion in the conversation. I want to ask, starting with you, Daniela, what do you see as the importance in terms of setting out these frameworks and the outcomes of communication for listening and understanding the messaging?
Yeah, good question. I think that we're still stuck a bit in this model of sender-receiver, sort of sender, message, receiver, just send it out, hope for the best, they'll sort it out. And I think that that's really important to get out of. We have started a few years ago, but it's already too late, I find. But we started to do social media listening, so for our digital audiences. So in advance of our campaigns or our sort of corporate communications work, we see what people are saying around certain topics. Our challenge is that we have already defined the topics for our campaigns years in advance. So say that next year is water and peace, but what we're seeing the trend is that people want to discuss climate change and human rights. So then we need to find a way to tailor our messaging to tap into those conversations that are already happening that people care about. And we didn't have that insight before. So that's just on a very broad sort of digital level, but at least it's a start.
So flexibility and being able to pivot a little bit faster than otherwise. Astrid?
This is about embracing change, right? And listening is super important when you want people to embrace change. You need to listen to people, also to understand their concerns or disbeliefs. But I also think in this, and then we're back to what solutions do we actually have right now? Not enough. And I think also no one has the answer or the solution. And if we are to find the solutions to the world's water and climate challenges, we need to listen, because it is in the listening that we find the solutions. So from a private sector perspective, we need to listen to our customers to fully understand what is their problem? And how can we contribute to finding solutions to that? So listening is the new black.
So listening is the way to find active solutions. Stella, with that, I give you the last word on what would you like to see from a communications perspective on the importance of listening to the audience and to the customers.
Great. Yeah, I'll give a slightly different perspective. So for me, I think listening, I'm looking at listening in terms of using it as a tool to change not necessarily the behavior of the people or the people being listened to, but the behavior of the stakeholders, those who are sending out the messaging. And I remember one particular dialogue that we had on the Good Food Hub, which I've just spoken about, on SMEs and climate resilience, that was attended by leaders from UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Food and Agriculture Organization, World Food Programme. So all these people were in attendance in the same sitting as these SMEs. And then we had this brilliant Brazilian entrepreneur who voiced that advancing climate resilience as a small business owner is really very, very lonely work. But he demonstrated such commitment to each stage of his production cycle, having a positive climate impact. And so this gave insight to the stakeholders who really recognize that collaborating with SMEs early on in the process, as Astrid said earlier in the conversation, getting involved really early in the process as a great way to bring about fresh, innovative ideas. So it can help both sides of the party, I think. It will be very necessary for them to join the conversation earlier, to move ideas from pilots to becoming real solutions. So yeah, from both sides, that's brilliant.
Thank you, Stella. That also reflects the opening keynote we had yesterday, which is if you want concrete solutions, you need to include everyone as equals in the beginning of the process. Thank you all for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts and taking the time. Let's give them a warm hand of applause.